When you're going in a helicopter 3 to 4 times a week and killing an average of 20 to 30 pigs every time you go, and the crop still gets completely destroyed, that's a problem.
The most dangerous invasion in modern America is happening right inside Texas. What began with a few pigs has grown into an uncontrollable crisis, tearing through farmland, suburbs, and entire ecosystems. But this isn't the darkest part.
The pig thing, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one thing that I keep hearing out here from folks. There's an attitude about pigs that they're disgusting, they're just dirty creatures, and they kind of just want them dead. That seems not just wasteful.
Footage from the eradication aftermath shows unnatural hog adaptations and traces of biohazard threats that may be closer than you think. How did a rescue plan create a new disaster? And why is it being hidden from the public? The footage Texas never wanted you to see. The wild hog eradication operation was supposed to be the solution. A clean, decisive answer to an infestation threatening an entire ecosystem. But instead of relief, the aftermath exposed something far more disturbing. Something Texas is absolutely not prepared to show the world. Out in those open fields, far from any public witness, something is unfolding that feels less like pest control and more like the early signs of an ecological war. When Texas launched its wild hog eradication programs, the mission sounded straightforward. Eliminate the hogs, restore the land, and reduce the damage. Yet, the teams sent into these zones kept encountering a reality that didn't match the promise. A reality documented in their notes, their reports, and in fragments of internal recordings never meant to surface. Across multiple eradication sites, the scene left behind looked nothing like the controlled, efficient operation outlined on paper. Carcasses were scattered in numbers that stunned even the workers assigned to clean them. Some bodies were piled along fence lines, others slumped into creek beds, and many lay exactly where they fell, forming grim mounds of decay. But the sheer volume of carcasses wasn't the worst part. The real danger was what they were doing to the land. As the bodies accumulated, the environment around them began changing at a pace nobody had anticipated. Cleanup crews reported sudden surges of scavengers flooding into the cleared areas, vultures lining the tree rows, coyotes pacing the perimeter before dawn, and even stray dogs drawn from miles away by the scent. Internal notes from field teams suggest that the disposal practices happening at these eradication sites may be triggering a biohazard problem. Texas has no intention of making public. Mass carcasses, rapid decomposition, and shifting weather form a combination capable of contaminating soil and water in ways that could spiral far beyond the boundaries of any one ranch. And the most disturbing part? They just might be trying to keep it all under wraps. Cameras captured only what was polished enough for press releases. Officials only highlighted the numbers of hogs removed, the damage reduced, and the money saved. While the darker side of the operation, the piles, the scavenger surges, and the contamination risks, stayed almost entirely off the public record. The question is, while trying to fix one ecological crisis, did Texas ignite another one it can barely contain? Because the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. There's a disturbing reason the stakes are this high, and why the state has been pushed into measures this extreme just to get rid of these wild hogs. Texas tried to solve a crisis that was growing too fast. Texas's hog problem didn't appear overnight. It built itself quietly, spilling across the state faster than anyone expected, until the numbers became too large for officials to ignore. Texas now holds the largest feral hog population in the United States, with estimates ranging from 2.6 to 3 million animals roaming its land. And the most alarming part? Almost every corner of the state is affected. Back in the 1980s, feral hogs occupied only a fraction of Texas counties, roughly 23%. At the time, their spread felt distant, like something manageable with enough local effort. But the hogs expanded faster than the reports predicted, adapting to new regions with almost no resistance. Today, they exist in nearly 99% of the entire state. With this spread came unimaginable damage. We're talking about full-scale destruction that began cutting straight into the backbone of the state's economy. Texas loses an estimated $871 million every year from wild hog activity. Crops are destroyed, fences torn apart, pastures uprooted, and equipment damaged. And that number doesn't include the livestock injuries, vehicle collisions, or disease risks that follow them. Zoom out beyond Texas, and the picture grows even larger. Across 13 states, national losses now exceed $1.6 billion annually. The hog crisis isn't just a Texas problem anymore. Texas is simply where the problem became impossible to ignore. Early attempts to control the invasion were small, local, and badly outmatched. Ranchers hunted the animals on sight. Communities used small traps, improvised fences, and borrowed methods from traditional livestock control. However, hogs aren't livestock. They are intelligent, cautious, and highly adaptable. They avoid traps after a single mistake. They shift travel routes when pressured, and their reproduction rate outpaces every method thrown at them. A typical sow can produce 2 litters a year, each with 6 to 12 piglets. Even when hunters removed large groups, the population surged right back because the growth rate simply overwhelmed the removal rate. By the early 2000s, the situation had moved far beyond local control. Texas wasn't dealing with a nuisance anymore. It was facing a full statewide invasion. The small traps weren't enough, and neither were the random hunts. Soon, officials realized they couldn't keep chasing the pigs. They needed an organized statewide strategy designed for an animal that learned, adapted, and repopulated faster than any traditional method could contain. And that is when Texas shifted from scattered responses to radical eradication planning, a turning point that set the stage for some controversial measures that left many in shock. A radical strategy hits the green light. Texas realized something scary. If nothing changed, the wild hog population could grow by 30% every single year. At that pace, the damage would spread faster than any agency could keep up with. So, with pressure building and the crisis expanding across almost every county, the state had to try something bold, even if those choices made people uneasy. One of the most controversial strategies was the authorization of aerial gunning programs. Under normal circumstances, shooting animals from aircraft is tightly restricted by the Federal Airborne Hunting Act. But Texas secured depredation permits that allowed trained crews to fly over rangelands and take out hogs from the air. It was a drastic step, risky, expensive, and extremely technical. Yet officials argued the situation had left them no other option. The hogs were moving too fast on the ground. Helicopters were the only way to reach the numbers required for any noticeable impact. But this strategy was nowhere near as aggressive and controversial as the next one suggested by state agencies. This strategy was known as the poison trial. Products like warfarin-based baits and a commercial option known as kaput feral hog bait were tested and debated as potential shortcuts to mass removal. The idea was simple. A chemical solution could reach places traps and helicopters never could. But the backlash was immediate. Ranchers warned about risks to livestock. Wildlife groups raised concerns about secondary poisoning. The public distrust grew fast enough that Texas paused any widespread rollout. Poisoning never reached the scale originally considered. But the fact that it came so close shows how desperate the situation had become. Slowly, the language used inside agencies began to shift. Hogs were no longer treated as a nuisance or pest. They were described in terms usually reserved for large-scale ecological threats. Some officials framed the eradication push as a form of operational readiness, a coordinated response to an invasive species capable of tearing apart agriculture, damaging ecosystems, and rewriting the landscape if left alone. So, once the aerial gunning strategy received full approval, the first deployments focused on open rangeland counties, the places with the highest density and the fastest-moving populations. These wide, open fields offered the best chance for mass removal before the hogs could scatter into brush or cross onto private land, where operations were more restricted. It was ambitious, high-risk, and unlike anything the state had attempted before. For a moment, it looked controlled, almost clinical in its design. Helicopters, teams, protocols, and coordinated lines of movement gave the impression that Texas finally had the upper hand. But once the operation actually began, the ground reality told a different story. The operation starts, and everything looks controlled. The early aerial gunning flights came back with numbers that impressed everyone in the command centers. In some targeted areas, a single flight removed around 31% of the hog population, and follow-up flights only pushed those numbers higher. For a moment, it seemed like the state had finally found a tool powerful enough to match the scale of the crisis. Field teams working on the ground reported the same sense of order. Crews and helicopters moved in sync, each one feeding real-time information to the other. Shooters communicated cleanly with pilots. Ground units marked out the boundaries, tracked movement, and cleared paths for the aircraft to sweep through. It was the closest Texas had ever come to coordinated pressure on a species that usually stayed 3 steps ahead. At the same time, another strategy, known as trapping, saw its own breakthrough. The state expanded the use of corral traps and newer smart traps that triggered through mobile apps only when entire sounders stepped inside. These traps avoided the old problem of catching just a few hogs and teaching the rest to stay away. Now, whole groups were being captured at once, reducing the chance of survivors breaking off and rebuilding the population somewhere else. It wasn't long before agencies began speaking with confidence. They released numbers that suggested measurable progress. They emphasized control, planning, and the promise of steady pressure over time. The operations weren't perfect, but at least they were structured, predictable, and running far better than the chaotic attempts of earlier years. For the first time in decades, Texas felt like it wasn't simply reacting to the hog problem. It was actively pushing back. However, as the weeks passed, small irregularities began showing up in field notes and internal logs, details easy to ignore at first, yet impossible to overlook once they began repeating themselves. Then the footage takes a hard turn. The early confidence didn't last long. As more material from the field came in, the tone inside the operations began to shift. What looked controlled at first slowly opened up a different reality, shaped by the hogs themselves. Teams began noticing and documenting new wild hog behaviors they had never experienced before nor planned for. In several regions, hogs moved with a level of coordination that didn't match the older reports. Workers noticed the animals acting like sentries, standing at a distance while the rest of the group fed or traveled. When helicopters approached, these lookout hogs reacted first, triggering sudden movements through the entire sounder. This wasn't a random panic. It was fast, synchronized, and difficult to counter. The moment the first animal bolted, The rest followed, scattering into thickets, riverbeds, and deep brush before shooters could lock onto them. In the beginning, crews thought the behavior was a coincidence, but after the same pattern repeated across multiple counties, it was clear the hogs had adapted to the pressure. To make matters worse, their panic didn't only disrupt the operations, it pushed the animals into new areas. Some escaped into places where they hadn't been documented before, creating new pockets of activity that hadn't been part of the original maps. Texas thought they had begun a controlled hit on concentrated groups, but it slowly turned into a chase across unfamiliar ground. Months after some of the first eradication sweeps, another problem surfaced. Teams revisited areas expecting lower numbers. Instead, they found signs of rebound populations. The hogs that survived earlier flights had reproduced quickly, far quicker than the models predicted. In certain sites, the population had nearly rebuilt itself in a fraction of the expected time. The operations were removing large numbers, yes, but the survivors were multiplying at a pace that threatened to erase the gains. Movement patterns complicated things even further. Crews expected the hogs to avoid crossing rivers or deep water. Yet, they found fresh tracks on the opposite side of currents they assumed were natural barriers. This wasn't the only complication. Dense cover also played a role. Hogs vanished into terrain that helicopters couldn't penetrate, reappearing miles away where teams had no aerial support. County by county, the results became uneven. Some operations showed strong reductions. Others barely dented the population. And in a few regions, the outcomes were so inconsistent that officials struggled to explain the variations in their reports. And as the operation continued, the consequences of these surprises began surfacing in the aftermath on the ground that no one had planned for. The aftermath begins to reveal itself. The first signs of trouble appeared in the landscapes. When teams returned to areas that had already gone through eradication, the ground told a different story from the clean numbers in the files. Large stretches of soil were torn up, as if something had dragged through them again and again. Tracks, ruts, and deep pits left behind by rooting hogs cut across fields that were supposed to be recovering. In fact, some places still held carcass remains from earlier operations. Scavengers had stripped them, leaving bones scattered across dry patches of earth. Workers noted vultures circling the same sites each morning, waiting for whatever was left. These weren't signs of a problem under control. They were signs of an environment still reacting to everything the hogs had done and everything the removals had missed. The most disturbing consequence of this eradication operation was discovered when the water data began to come in. Environmental teams monitoring nearby creeks and streams noticed a rise in sediment levels. The more they checked, the clearer the connection became. Rooting and wallowing from hogs were loosening soil, pushing mud into waterways and clouding the currents. In some streams, the tests showed bacteria levels as high as 40 times above normal, especially in places where hog activity had been heaviest. Teams warned that the sheer number of carcasses might mean contamination was spreading farther than anyone thought. They wrote about rainwater carrying runoff, pools of standing water forming near the carcass sites, and patches of soft ground where fluids had already soaked into the soil. Every note pointed to the same thing. The damage wasn't ending when the hogs were cleared. It was continuing. At the same time, officials began noticing a different kind of damage. Erosion was getting worse. Grass and young plants were disappearing. Areas that should have started healing after the eradication were losing even more vegetation instead of growing it back. With fewer roots holding the soil together, the ground kept breaking apart under rain, wind, and passing animals. All these signs pointed to the same conclusion. The aftermath of the eradication operation was insane. The state's goal had been merely to stop the hogs, protect the land, and restore balance. But the more crews revisited these sites, the clearer it became that the crisis wasn't ending when the hogs were removed. The land was still shifting, reacting, and, in some places, falling apart faster than before. These early warnings suggested a chain reaction in the ecosystem that reached far beyond the original mission. And as teams continued surveying the area, even more unexpected problems began to appear, spreading outward from the places the hogs once controlled. Unintended consequences surface and spread fast. The problems caused by the eradication operation didn't stay in one place. They spread outward, creating new issues that reached ranches, livestock areas, and even nearby rural towns. One of the first warnings came from how the carcasses were handled. Many sites didn't have the tools or time for proper disposal, and the remains left behind started affecting the ground underneath them. Soil tests showed small pockets of contamination where fluids had collected, and after rainfall, some of that contamination washed into low areas and shallow water. These conditions created risks not just for the land, but for the animals living nearby. Ranch workers started raising alarms about diseases linked to feral hogs, including swine, brucellosis, and pseudorabies. Both can spread through contact with infected hogs or contaminated materials. Even the chance of exposure was enough to make some ranchers change how they managed their herds. Rural communities felt the strain too. Even after eradication efforts, many towns found fences broken again, crops damaged, and small water sources disturbed by hogs that had slipped past the early operations. In many places, the damage didn't disappear, it simply moved, showing up on the edges of properties that were never part of the original removal zones. That's not all. Wildlife experts began noticing another ripple effect that wasn't obvious at first. As hog numbers shifted and grew in certain areas, they started competing with native animals for food. Deer, for example, depend heavily on acorns during certain seasons. Hogs do as well, but they often arrive in bigger groups, leaving far less for the animals that rely on those resources. At the same time, hogs tearing through brushlands created new threats for ground-nesting birds. Reports showed rising predation on quail nests, an issue made worse by the fact that these bird populations were already struggling before the hog problem escalated. As these reports built up, the debate over Texas's strategy widened. Officials defended the decisions made under pressure. Ranchers shared what they were still seeing on the ground. Wildlife groups pushed for clearer explanations, and researchers kept releasing data that showed new connections between hog activity, land health, and the broader ecosystem. By this point, the state wasn't just dealing with an invasive species. It was dealing with a growing list of consequences tied directly to the methods used to fight it. And with each new problem documented, Texas began facing backlash on almost every front. Texas faced a backlash nobody forecasted. The first wave of shock came when media outlets began showing a different side of the hog problem that had nothing to do with ranch land or open fields. News stations began airing footage from suburbs and small towns where hogs were tearing up lawns, wandering near school grounds, and crossing neighborhood streets as if they belonged there. For many people who had never seen a wild hog up close, these images changed the conversation from a distant agricultural issue to an urgent, real-world problem. Viewers wanted answers, and officials were suddenly facing questions they weren't prepared to answer. Meanwhile, the voices of people living in rural communities were growing sharper. Farmers and ranchers had supported the eradication programs, hoping for real relief. But many of them watched the same cycle repeat. Damage repaired one season, only for new groups of hogs to show up the next. Some fields were torn up again within months of being restored. Water troughs were tipped over. Fences were broken so many times that repairs became part of the weekly routine. Their frustration wasn't just about the hogs. It was about the promise that the eradication efforts would finally turn the tide. Environmental groups also joined the backlash from another angle. They called out the continued and undocumented use of toxicants, despite earlier warnings that non-target species, like deer, birds, and even pets, could be exposed through direct contact or by feeding on tainted carcasses. Caught between public concern, scientific warnings, and mounting pressure from landowners, state officials tried to push out new data. They released charts showing hog numbers. They shared updates on flights, trap counts, and regional progress. But the more numbers they released, the more their results looked uneven. In many places, the success stories were far smaller than the losses still happening each year. The pressure only grew heavier. Reports from counties with continued damage clashed with the optimistic updates shared in press releases. The gap between what the public saw and what officials hoped for widened with every new news segment and every frustrated landowner interview. By this stage, it became clear to everyone that the original plan, no matter how aggressive, wasn't enough. The hogs were adapting. The damage was spreading. The backlash was rising. And the state was being pushed into a corner where doing the same thing again simply wasn't an option. Something had to change. A reset was coming. And Texas knew it needed a new direction, fast. A hard reset and a surprising new direction. Instead of relying on one dominant method, agencies began shifting toward integrated pest management. The idea was quite simple. Rather than focusing on a single tactic like aerial gunning or trapping, the state would combine several tools at once: coordinated trapping, ground hunting, strategic fencing, and targeted removal, where sounders were known to gather. It was slower than flying helicopters over rangeland, but it offered something the earlier methods couldn't: long-term pressure instead of quick hits that yielded unsustainable results. One of the biggest changes was the renewed focus on whole sounder removal. The earlier approach had often resulted in partial kills where only a few hogs from each group were taken out. Those survivors later scattered, reproduced, and repopulated entire areas. Experts pushed agencies to rethink the process. The new goal was simple. If a trap was set or a hunt was planned, it needed to remove the entire group at once, not just a fraction. This shift alone changed how teams set up corral traps, how they monitored sounder movement, and how they timed their operations. As the state adapted, researchers and wildlife specialists proposed something Texas had rarely tried on a large scale: the cooperative landowner networks. Here's how it works. Instead of each property owner fighting the hogs alone, experts encouraged neighbors to share traps, coordinate hunts, and exchange data on animal movement. Unsurprisingly, it worked. Where these networks formed, patterns began to shift. Hogs had fewer escape routes. Sounders encountered pressure from several sides at once. And in some pockets of the state, the damage reports finally began to slow. While Texas had already suffered billions in cumulative losses over the decades, there were places where the new approach was showing real promise. Counties with strong cooperation saw reduced rooting, cleaner pastures, and smaller groups of hogs surviving across each season. It wasn't a full victory, but it was the first sign that the crisis could be managed if enough people worked together. Even with the reset, the problems were not entirely over. Hogs kept moving into towns and suburbs, pushing deeper into areas that were much harder to control. Traps weren't always safe to use, and organized hunts were nearly impossible in crowded neighborhoods. Soon, rumors began spreading about something even more unsettling: larger, tougher feral hog hybrids moving south from Canada. Some people called them super pigs, a mix of wild boar and domestic breeds that could survive harsh winters and spread quickly across new areas. Whether the threat was exaggerated or not, it added another layer of worry to a problem already stretching across almost the entire state. Texas had taken a new direction out of necessity. The shift to integrated methods brought progress in places that had once seemed hopeless. But even with better tools, stronger cooperation, and clearer goals, the state was nowhere near the end of this fight. But what does all of this mean for Texas? And how much harder will the road ahead become? What the footage means for Texas and everyone watching. When officials stepped back and reviewed years of eradication work, a difficult truth became impossible to avoid. Every model, every field report, and every long-term data set pointed to the same requirement. Texas would need to remove at least 70% of its feral hog population every single year just to keep the numbers from rising. Not to win the fight, not to erase the hogs, just to stop the population from growing. That number alone rewrote the entire conversation about what Texas was facing. It turned the footage, the internal notes, and the field recordings into more than operations data. They became a record of how a state learned its limits in real time. Over the years, Texas has unintentionally become a national case study in invasive species control. Researchers, wildlife agencies, and landowners across the country studied the state's strategy, from the early missteps to the aggressive experiments and, later, the more balanced direction. The story showed what could work, what could collapse under pressure, and how quickly an invasive species could outmaneuver a plane that wasn't built to adapt. The long-term effects of this experience are starting to show. Policies have shifted away from one-size-fits-all removal and toward approaches that change with the conditions on the ground. The new focus on cooperative networks, whole sounder removal, data sharing, and flexible planning has shaped what many experts now call adaptive management, methods that grow smarter as the crisis evolves. Unsupervised, these approaches didn't stay inside Texas. National parks, rural counties, and wildlife departments across the United States now use guides shaped by the research coming out of the state's agricultural researchers. Their work on trapping, sound behavior, environmental impacts, and long-term damage has become a roadmap for regions beginning to see the same signs Texas saw decades earlier. In some places, these guides helped prevent a small problem from becoming a statewide emergency. But even with all the knowledge gained, the crisis remains far from settled. Texas still faces hog raids in farmland, rooting in wetlands, and incursions into neighborhoods. Some counties report progress, while others are seeing numbers rise again. Urban areas have their own challenges. Rural areas are stretched thin. And the looming concern about tougher, more adaptable hog hybrids continues to circulate among wildlife experts. The footage collected over all these years, whether official, internal, or accidental, is proof that the problem goes far beyond mere eradication. It shows a state learning how hard it is to keep an invasive species in check once it spreads past a certain point. It shows how every victory requires constant pressure and how every pause gives the hogs room to grow again. It also shows how fragile the line is between control and collapse. In the end, one question remains, and it sits at the center of every policy change, every field test, every trap, and every helicopter flight. Can Texas ever reach real, lasting control? Or is this a forever war against feral hogs? What do you think? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.